The Last of Us gaming franchise doesn't really mention much about the origin of the infections, just a couple of hints about how it might have started, but the show has made sure everyone knows exactly what happened. And here's what they've revealed so far. The zombie infection is actually caused by cordyceps. The Last of Us Episode 3 goes deep into the science aspect of the cordyceps infection that took over humanity. And it was pretty well needed since there wasn't much explanation in the game. In this adaptation for HBO, the fans get to see a bit more about how it started and why it spread so quickly. The opening sequence of Episode 1 was especially great, with John Hannah giving us a powerful introduction to the virus. He connected it to global warming and how that could have been a contributing factor, something the fans didn't get in the original game. His description of the virus was so accurate, it's honestly hard to believe he died before the outbreak. In the second episode of The Last of Us, you get to see the opening sequence in Jakarta, Indonesia. This is very different compared to the South American origin story of cordyceps infection in the first game, which was inspired by real-world parasitic fungi and their habitat.
Jakarta. Where is that, Middle East?
Doesn't ring a bell. It's definitely a country. Maybe part of Asia.
Jakarta isn't a country. Being a part of Asia isn't mutually exclusive with being a country, and in fact...
It's also worth noting that Episode 3 doesn't feature any flashbacks related to the origin of the cordyceps infection, although Joel and Ellie's conversation reveals some interesting details that tie in with HBO's version of the condition. And what did the fans find out? The virus spreads through flour. In The Last of Us Episode 3, Joel explains the cause of the cordyceps virus. It mutated and spread through infected food sources. Think sugar, flour, bread, or cereal that people were consuming on a regular basis. This infection was so strong that it only took a certain amount of consumption before someone became infected. It's exactly what John Hannah was talking about in the first episode of the show.
Fungus. Yes, that's the usual response. Fungi seem harmless enough. Many species know otherwise, because there are some fungi who seek not to kill, but to control. Let me ask you, where do we get LSD from?
Where do you get it from?
It comes from ergot, a fungus.
When Joel explained the timeline of the infection, it was clear that once it entered a human host, it moved quickly. He points out that anyone who ate food on either Thursday the 25th or Friday the 26th of September was infected and began spreading the virus by nightfall on the 26th. It didn't take long for things to spiral out of control. By Monday, the world was already in chaos, and The Last of Us Episode 1's opening sequence shows just how quickly it all happened. This explanation actually has a few differences from the original game, but the two definitely have their similarities. The original game had the infected crops being traced back to South America, but in the show, it's revealed that they began in Jakarta, Indonesia. This sets up a huge difference from the infection origin featured in the game.
If we're out in the open city, why aren't we getting swarmed?
Don't worry about that.
Well, I'm gonna.
What was Marlene doing with an infected kid?
I'm not infected. She found me after I was bitten.
And she didn't shoot you.
Clearly not. She locked me up and had her guys test me every day to see if I was getting sick.
You also get to find out more details about how global warming led to an unexpected mutation of the cordyceps virus, which further highlights the differences between the game and the show. It's also kind of crazy that it was humans who caused this in the first place. Without global warming, the virus would have probably never mutated and never spread all over the world. While the newspaper from the game reveals infected crops having spread mainly to Central and North America, Joel explains in Episode 3 that cordyceps, which is a type of fungi found only in The Last of Us, has been discovered in other continents. So it's pretty clear that the way the infection spreads is similar to what you saw in the game, just with a few changes here and there, like location. Although a lot of people thought the whole concept of the infection spreading through flour was kind of strange, but that's exactly how infection can spread in real life. From the opening of The Last of Us, it's easy to tell that this story doesn't mess around when it comes to making the cordyceps infection seem realistic. Even though we know this type of virus doesn't exist in real life, HBO has done an incredible job of making us think that it could one day become a reality. Take, for example, the events in episode 3, where the infection is spreading via food supplies. This kind of thing actually could happen, and it's just one more example of how The Last of Us has managed to make its fictional world feel so believable. The Last of Us, episode 2, does a great job of showing us just how realistic the infection's origin story is. Professor Ratna describes the flour and grain silo, where it all began, as a perfect substrate, which makes total sense from a biological standpoint. Substrates are environments where certain organisms, like fungi, live, grow, and spread. And as we all know, fungi often use grain products like brown rice, rye grain, or popcorn as a medium to thrive in. This means it wouldn't be too far-fetched for a mutated strain of cordyceps to find its way into the human food chain and cause an infection. It's the kind of attention to detail that makes The Last of Us such a terrifying experience, one that brings the real-world danger of cordyceps to life, and they only took it to a whole new level by changing where the infection started. The Jakarta infection origin completely changes the story. HBO's adaptation of The Last of Us has kept the origin of the infection mostly unchanged. In episode 2, you learn that it all started with residents from Jakarta getting infected by a flour and grain factory in the city. But there's one major change. Instead of South America being the epicenter of where the whole thing began, it's now Asia. This change makes a lot of sense given the hints in episode 1 about global warming and its potentially devastating effects. This seemingly minor change actually makes a lot of sense when you consider the origin of the cordyceps fungi, which The Last of Us infection is based on. The fact is that out of the 600 species of real-world cordyceps, most are found in Asia, so it makes more sense for an outbreak to originate somewhere like Jakarta, rather than South America. This makes perfect sense when you consider that an Asian country like Indonesia is far more likely to be home to mutated forms of the fungi because of its abundance on the continent. The origin of the infection isn't the only thing the show sheds a light on, though. They also explain the timeline of the outbreak. The cordyceps outbreak has become a huge part of the story in The Last of Us franchise, and episode 2 sheds light on where it all began. The fans learn that the Jakarta section of episode 2 takes place on September 24, 2003, which is 2 days before Sarah's death and the opening of episode 1. It's obvious that the infection had already begun to take hold of the city by this point, as you see a number of workers who have gone unaccounted for. The speed at which this mutated cordyceps virus spread across the globe is pretty crazy. It started in a flour and grain factory, with the infection likely taking hold of wheat-based products intended for worldwide distribution. To put into perspective just how quickly this virus was able to take off, let me paint you a picture. The dead Jakartan woman was infected 30 hours before September 24th, and the virus is known to take hold between 24 and 48 hours after infection. This means that by the 24th, the outbreak had already begun. It seems that Indonesia's position as one of the world's top exporters of wheat products meant that mutated cordyceps had its perfect breeding ground, with it quickly taking hold and beginning to spread across the globe. That was just about everything you needed to know about the origin of the virus in The Last of Us, and we'll see you in the next video.
This isn't gonna end well, Tess. We need to go back.